How Prophecy and Conspiracy Are Linked, Part 2. Part 2 of this topic will continue to look at the prophecies of the Bible from the viewpoint of the many conspiracies and conspiracy theories unfolding constantly in our world. The governmental powers of this system have hijacked even the words conspiracy theory to shut off the minds of the people, to ask questions, to think critically and logically of any event that goes against the government's official narratives. And so, is it possible that the prophecies are unfolding right in front of us all, but many are trained by the governments not to see it, because they are described as a conspiracy theory, to be viewed as foolishness? But the scripture says that the wisdom of this world is foolishness to God. 7 mountains, 7 kingdoms. Mountains are another symbol of government, raised up over the people, just as a mountain is raised up from the earth, appearing immovable, permanent, everlasting. The prophecy describes 7 dominant mountains or governments that would arise at different points in time and having some connection to the land of Israel and its people. Egypt would enslave them, Assyria would attack and disperse them, Babylon would destroy and capture them, Medo-Persia would release and restore them, Greece would attack and desecrate them, Rome would dominate, destroy, and disperse them, and in the 20th century, Britain and the United States would return and restore them. So the dominant mountain or government of our point in the timeline is the United States and Britain, with many of the prophecies focused on this dual world power's role and actions in our world. Also, the prophecy states that this world power, no matter how strong its military, or how advanced its science and technology, or how dominant its economy is, it, like all of the mountains, will be removed from its place. The 8th kingdom, the New World Order. In the Bible, the number 7 is the symbol of completion, and the number 8 is the symbol of a new beginning. And so it was not just Britain and the United States, the 7th world power, to return and restore Israel, but the 8th power, the League of Nations, as well, with the 1917 Balfour Declaration, and then the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, making it a legal obligation for the international community. The mandate would establish the right of the Jewish people to rebuild their homeland, and with this act, a new beginning had occurred, in which the dominant authority is not an individual nation, but an international organization that will have authority over the governments or mountains of the earth. Its first manifestation was as the League of Nations, but it will return after World War II as the United Nations and begin its rise to eventually subdue all of the governments of the earth under its authority. This is the process of the New World Order, and it continues up to today. The struggle for world domination. The king of the north versus the king of the south. The prophecy in the book of Daniel, chapter 8 and 11, shows in symbolic form the struggle of nations for world domination. The first symbolic form described in Daniel 8 is about a 2-horned ram, representing the Persian and Median Empire, the dominant power on earth for a certain period of time. Then it describes a nation from the west rising up to challenge it. This is the he-goat, representing the kingdom of Greece, that would eventually overcome and crush the Persian Empire and become the dominant power on earth. The prophecy also shows how the Greek Empire would be divided after the death of Alexander the Great, and how the struggle for world domination would progress down through the centuries. In Daniel chapter 11, it shows details of this struggle. symbolically represented by a king of the North versus a king of the South, meant to show the opposite or opposing nature of these rising and falling powers down through the centuries, even up to our time now, and what will happen next in the struggle for world domination. The rise of the American superpower, 1991. With the beginning of the 20th century, the great powers of Europe began to position themselves for this struggle for world domination. But with the start of World War I in 1914, America, from the West, would begin its rise to become the most dominant nation in the history of the world and the last remaining superpower. America, along with its chief ally Britain, would go on to defeat three powers that would oppose them in this struggle, the first being the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the Bulgarian Empire in World War I. Then they would go on to defeat the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II, and then defeat and outlast the Soviet Empire in the Cold War, for America to become the dominant power with no one to rival it. So with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, America would take its place among the dominant nations of history, and the prophecy of the book of Revelation tells the events of this seventh world power's reign and its fall like the empires of the past. The first woe against America, the terrorism crisis. In the book of Revelation, chapter 9, it describes three woes or calamities that would come against this seventh world power and the fallout from it that would ripple around the world. It can be seen almost immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the U.S. and Britain, under the United Nations resolution, would become tied up in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf War, and the sanctions against Saddam Hussein's Iraq beginning in 1991. And their adventure into the Middle East would trigger the most devastating attack on the U.S. homeland just 10 years later, with the attacks of September the 11th in 2001. This woe or calamity against it would begin to fundamentally transform and weaken it, politically, economically, and militarily, in ways that seem to go unnoticed by its population. But this calamity would also show the true face of this deceptive beast power that will become exposed for all of the world to see. Men will seek death, but death will flee from them. Revelation 9. After the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. would shift to a policy of so-called enhanced interrogation or torture across the Middle East and around the world. And so when does a man seek death? It is usually under the circumstance of being in an extreme pain or being tortured, and not allowed to die by your captors. This would unfold for thousands caught up in sweeps and mass arrests in the Middle East under the so-called War on Terror. But these actions would be exposed, as the United States would be condemned for human rights violations and war crimes by the international community. The second woe against America, the COVID-19 crisis. Like the first woe or calamity, the terrorism crisis against the U.S. would begin to come to its end as soon as the second calamity or woe was about to begin. Although COVID-19 would begin in China and would affect the whole world, it is the United States that would have more cases and deaths than any other country on earth. And it is believed that the virus came from the Chinese lab, with gain-of-function coronaviruses from the United States that may have started the entire pandemic. Also, as the dominant power, it would spend more money on the pandemic than every other country in the world, but have the worst COVID outcomes. Not to mention the inflation damage that is still crippling the nation right now, with the price of nearly everything doubling since 2020. But the prophecy of Revelation tells of an even greater devastation coming due to this COVID-19 crisis. The four angels bound at the Euphrates River. The book of Revelation, chapter 9, speaks of four angels, or messengers, bound at the Euphrates River, being released. The symbolic reference to the Euphrates River applies to how the ancient kingdom of Babylon was overthrown by the Euphrates River being dried up by the Persian army to enter Babylon and kill its king in one night. So in Revelation, the prophecy pertains to Babylon the Great, the corporate system that supports and works with the governments to produce the pharmakia that has been unleashed. The four messenger platform systems to the populations of primarily the United States and Britain, with the RNA and DNA messenger systems used to fight against COVID. But already the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca DNA messenger systems have been stopped, but the damage has already been done. And when the last two RNA messenger systems of Pfizer and Moderna are stopped, we will see the fall of Babylon the Great and a massive devastation on the earth. The Second Woe Against America, Part 2. The Coming Nuclear Crisis. The second woe of Revelation chapter 11 appears to have two parts, or two sequences to it. The first being the COVID-19 crisis, and the second part being a nuclear crisis so great that the people of the world have a huge celebration when it appears as though this crisis is over. And then it says the unthinkable will happen. The nuclear weapons will be unleashed on this earth, but to what degree or magnitude is unknown. But the prophecy of Revelation describes all of mankind hiding themselves in caves and rocks of the mountains, possibly in the bunkers that the governments have been preparing for decades. But there is a third woe, or calamity, that will finish off this entire world system. Every part will be methodically decimated, beginning with the seventh world power, and even the eighth world power will be dissolved.